Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for spending some time with the Partnership of Historic Bostons, wherever you're joining us from. Um, my name's Ivana Tamayo, and I'll be opening and closing this event. I'm going to give you a little information on the Partnership of Historic Bostons, also our wonderful panelists, and give you an overview of the structure of the evening and some tips, some ways that you can participate. So let me begin with telling you a little bit about the Partnership of Historic Bostons. The partnership is a small nonprofit historical organization dedicated to public history to tell the stories of the lives and to share the ideas of 17th century Massachusetts and New England. The 17th century sometimes doesn't get the coverage that it could. And so this partnership really illuminates this history. And what it does is through understanding the past, we can come to a greater appreciation of our present. The partnership, as a public history organization, offers lectures, discussions, walking tours, and a book club. I will share with you a little bit of that later. And tonight's event is a discussion. So we're going to be hearing from three wonderful panelists who are going to tell us, engage in a conversation about uh, resistance to witchcraft. And with that, let me tell you a little bit about our event. Tonight is the second part in a two-part series on the nature of witch hunts. In the first part, on September 8th, the panelists explored why witch hunts happen. They discussed the accusers and the accused. They discussed the willingness of people to other and victimize their members of their community. And now, as we move into the second part of the series, we are going to be looking at the panel is actually going to be illuminating for us the nature of the resistance. And a big question they're going to explore for us is what gave people the courage to stand up and defend their loved ones and their community members in the face of such opposition and when it could cost them everything. The panel is also going to explore how Salem moved on from witchcraft, the witchcraft crisis, how it healed, and they're also going to talk about a really critical part of this theme, which is how do we prevent future witch hunts from happening? Um, with that, I want to share with you a little bit about our panelists. We have Emerson Baker. We have Josh Hutchinson, and Sarah Jack. Um, Dr. Emerson Baker, he's a professor of history at Salem State University, and he has served also as vice provost and dean. He's written 6 books on the history and archaeology of early New England. And if you want a fantastic book on the Salem witch trials, he also is the author of A Storm of Witchcraft. Again, it's going to give you an in-depth understanding of the crisis and its aftermath. He's working on a new book that's going to explore the aftermath of the trials. Finally, if you follow historical documentaries and you watch any programs on the Salem witch trials, more than likely you can catch him as an on-camera expert or see his name in the credits as a consultant. He's worked with PBS, the BBC, Smithsonian, and TLC. Josh Hutchinson is a podcaster, writer, and advocate. He's the co-founder, along with Sarah Jack, of End Witch Hunts and the creator of The Thing About Witch Hunts and The Thing About Salem. His work sheds light on past witch hunts and advocates for the elimination of modern harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. As I mentioned before, his professional partner is Sarah Jack. She's the founding executive director of the nonprofit End Witch Hunts and the creator of the podcast, The Thing About Witch Hunts and The Thing About Salem. Our specialization is in teaching and consulting about witch hunts, and she utilizes her wide network of connections to broaden the conversation, to bring this out into the public. So we're very fortunate to have both Josh and Sarah bring a spotlight to um, witch hunts and how we respond to them. Witch Hunts is both an educational and advocacy focused organization, which makes a very nice collaboration with the partnership. And very, very briefly, because we want to get to a wonderful discussion, my name's Ivana Tamayo. I joined the partnership in spring as a volunteer. I have a couple book reviews up. You can see those on the page. I've also facilitated a storm of witchcraft, and I'll be launching This Land is Their Land, a book that looks at Thanksgiving, as it were, from the Indigenous perspective. So we'll have two events, book club discussions, one in October and one in November, and you can check out more information on historicbostons.org. And finally, I am based in Florida, but I grew up loving history, have spent a lot of time visiting New England and Salem, and just have been totally captivated by the stories of those who've lived there, and also really blown away by the wonderful historic preservation and archaeological work that's been done, of which Dr. Baker has participated. And so to have the opportunity to give back to a field I love is really, really exciting. And as I mentioned before, this is a public history organization. Our events are free, but there are costs associated with publicizing, platforming, and communicating with our network. So please do consider making a donation, as it really does help defray costs and help us focus on putting together great programming. You will hear a little bit more about the programming later. Now, we're going to transition into a few housekeeping items. This will be recorded, and the recording will be sent promptly, not tonight, but you should see it in your inbox tomorrow. Please, please, please utilize the chat. We'd love to have you share your questions. Again, as a reminder, this isn't a presentation, but it's a discussion. And so this is one way that you can get involved. And from there, at the end, I'll jump back in and share some other events that you can be on the lookout for. Again, I'm so glad you're able to join us. It's truly a privilege to learn from Dr. Baker, Josh Hutchinson, and Sarah Jack. And now over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful opener, Ivana, and thank you for volunteering. I'm so appreciative to Historic Boston for having us back. I'm really excited to get into this conversation. I just want to add that Josh and I are descendants of Salem witch trial victims and others involved in the community.
Yeah, as Ivana was mentioning, we did talk about the other 2 weeks ago. We talked about how people were defined as different and then targeted for accusations. Today, we're discussing another remarkable, though often overlooked aspect of the witch trials, the resistance they granted. Sarah and I are descended from Mary Esty, to answer a question that just popped up real quick. And she's also descended from Rebecca Nurse, so two of the Town sisters. But despite enormous pressure and danger, many of the people refused to accept the accusations, defended their neighbors, and worked to end the persecution. Before we begin, though, I want to take a moment. Today is September 22nd. It is the 333rd anniversary of the final executions of the Salem witch trials, when 8 people were hanged in Salem. They were Martha Corey, Mary Estey, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Prudiator, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. Now, turning to the first question, a striking feature of these New England witch trials was how neighbors defended each other, signed petitions denying accusations, and refused to cooperate with proceedings. Can you describe these acts of resistance? How widespread were they? And what enabled people to take such dangerous stances when opposing the witch hunt could make you a target?
It's a good question, Josh, and I think it's nice because it highlights maybe the silver lining to a really tragic event. But I was just counting in my head. I know at least 200 people who signed petitions on behalf of family, friends, and neighbors. There are really 3 of the accused who sort of garnered the most attention here. There were several petitions for Rebecca Nurse, also for John and Elizabeth Proctor, and also Mary Bradbury. Mary Bradbury's had over 115 signatures of people, men from her hometown of Salisbury, who testified or who signed. And when people are putting around petitions today, it's like, oh, sure, I guess I'll sign that. But this is like life or death matter, and really, you risked having the spotlight put on you if you said someone was not a witch, because the first thing someone might think is like, well, gosh, we thought you were just a good, upstanding Christian, but now you are defending witches. What might that say about you, right? Now, we're really fortunate, I think, that to my knowledge, there were no formal charges lodged against anybody who signed any of those petitions. I mean, frankly, it's kind of a miracle, I think. But the risk was absolutely there and was omnipresent. And I'm sure a lot of people had to think long and hard as to whether they were doing this or not, struggling with their conscience to do the right thing, but also worrying about what repercussions that might not just have for them, but for their entire family, right? So it really was, I think, an important act of resistance.
These petitions were acts of defiance in a way, and some individuals that were accused, like Rebecca Nurse, Mary Estey, George Jacobs Sr., they maintained their innocence even facing the execution. Mary Estey wrote a powerful petition urging that no more innocent blood be shed. How significant were these unwavering declarations of innocence? And how did this defiance, despite the immense pressure, challenge the prevailing narrative of guilt?
Well, I think they're incredibly powerful. And Mary Estey's, I know their family still holds that tradition very near to their hearts, that petition, as you folks know. But it's interesting to me because there were so many different ways that people could oppose, and also too in very selfless ways. Mary Estey, her letter is undated, so we're not exactly sure when she wrote it, but she starts it off by saying that she's been condemned, that is, she's been sentenced to death. So she writes really not on behalf of herself, but with some suggestions to the court to prevent, as she says, further bloodshed, right? That further innocent lives be lost, and makes some really good recommendations, like, would it be possible, for example, that we not allow the accusers, especially the afflicted accusers, to sit together and listen to each other's testimony so they can back each other up, and other sort of simple steps that could have really helped prevent maybe more deaths. And also, could the judges do a better job of helping to serve as defense counsel because they were both prosecutor and defense counsel, right? So, you know, to me, it's an incredibly selfless sort of thing to do. She's like, I'm not writing for me. I know it's too late for me. My time is here. But you see similar kinds of acts from many people in many different ways to resist. I mean, I've always been taken very much by John Proctor's letter that he writes to basically to the governor, to the council, to the ministers, to the judges, anybody who will listen, saying, there are people being tortured here. There are teenage boys being tortured to try to force a confession out of them. This is not right. It needs to stop, right? And all kinds of action like that. I mean, frankly, one of my I think one of my favorites, in some ways, to that resistance is well, it's seen in lots of different ways. I won't jump the gun and get into some other acts of resistance, but I think those petitions were in theory really important. I think maybe the sad thing is through a lot of this is we're talking about it took a long time for the witch trials to end, and we were talking about like these petitions. We're talking about events that happened throughout the summer and sort of gradually gaining momentum. And I think maybe at first they didn't have kind of the impact that we might hope for. It's not like we had a petition and everything changed. But I do think that there's this sort of underswelling of popular opinion. And part of it, I think I just want to mention too, is that for those of you who haven't studied this too much, we have almost 1,000 documents of the official court records that survive. We have very few, though, private letters or correspondence that survives. So it's really hard to gauge what impact some of these acts of resistance had, because we're not even sure how well known they were. How many people actually read Mary's petition, for example? We just don't know. But I'd like to think that there were a lot of maybe more actions similar to this that were playing out throughout the colony as that may not have survived because we don't have a lot of we only have one diary really from this time period and not much private correspondence at all too. So that is to say, we're just looking hopefully at the tip of the iceberg of resistance here.
Right. And the petitions were for a number of different, they were looking for a number of different outcomes. Like some were character witness testimony about how good and Christian a neighbor somebody was and how good their Christian conversation was throughout their life. They'd known them for 50 years and they'd never sworn or something like that. And some of them were actually to get the court to make procedural changes, like John Proctor's petition. He's asking for different things for the court to do.
And they went on a long time too. I mean, we're just talking about those initial petitions, which included, by the way, the Nurse family really had 2 rounds of them, right? Initially, they had the petitions of Rebecca's innocence, but then when that sort of fails and she's charged, there's another round where they are basically having people testify to undermine the credibility of some of the accused, or the accusers, I mean, right? And they're really taking much more direct action. And to me, some of them, the thing about these is I didn't mention is that what makes compelling to me is that this includes many of these people's political enemies. There are, I think, 6 or 7 Putnams who signed petitions in favor of Rebecca Nurse, and one, I think maybe it is John, who says, well, I know she's had differences with her neighbors, and frankly, he was on a different political side than the nurses were in village politics. But he said, but she's not a witch, right? This woman is not a witch. And so you have, again, a coming together, I think, in many ways of the community of different sides, trying to protect innocent lives, even if, again, like, we talked about this a little bit last time. Frankly, I think one of the problems we face today is that it's then and now, it was way too easy to demonize people as your enemy and in league with Satan, But more to the point, to say, well, we've had our differences, but they're good people and they're good neighbors. Bottom line, even if we disagree, and they're not witches.
Was Judge Saltonstall's resignation resistance?
I'd like to think so. Judge Saltonstall. We know again, no paperwork survives on this, right? He resigns, we believe, sometime around the sentencing or execution of Bridget Bishop. And frankly, Bridget Bishop, of course, is the first to be executed first to be tried and first to be executed on June 10th, 1692. And there is a lot of opposition that rises up in the wake of that from a number of different circles. And starting really at the top with Saltonstall, who's from a highly respected family from Haverhill. He's the colonel in command of the Northern Division of the Essex County Regiment. He's a member of the Governor's Council, which makes him, one of the leaders of the colony. He's a longtime sort of political leader, honored Harvard alum, on and on. But we don't really have a lot of grounds as to why he resigned, except Thomas Brattle in his letter indicates that he left because he was really disgruntled with the proceedings. He was upset with the proceedings and left. And I think, again, on the surface of this should have been an important event. And I think it probably sent a powerful message, but we just don't know what the trickle down was of that. Because again, it's not like the trial stopped when Saltonstall resigned. But you have to sort of look for these signs. And for example, like I'm briefly getting back to Rebecca Nurse, you could say, well, what effect did those petitions have? She was ultimately executed. Right. But did those petitions help to the point where Rebecca Nurse was initially found not guilty? And only when Judge Stoughton told the jury to reconsider some of the evidence did they change that view. So again, I'd like to think that Stoughton was one of the first really big, powerful people to kind of vote with his feet, that it made a difference. But unfortunately, it's one of these many things about the witch trials. I wish we had the kind of personal letters and information about his role in this, because I have a hunch there must have been a lot of talk in Salem and throughout the colony and the Governor's Council when he stepped away from this proceeding.
I'm going to ask you, because it's come up twice already. You've mentioned that we don't have a lot of the personal writings of people. Do you think that was intentional, that they didn't record a lot of their own feelings about the witch trials, or it's just lost to time?
I think it's partially intentional in some cases. I think trying to do 17th century history in New England, even though we have a highly literate society, and again, almost 1,000 records on the Salem witch trials, there's so much more we don't have. We really, we just, whether it's on the Salem witch trials or events 5 or 10 years either side of it, we don't have a lot of personal letters, diaries, this sort of stuff. More just sort of the official records and court records. Having said that, though, it's really clear to me, we know that there are records that were there in 1692 that are no longer in existence. So for example, Samuel Sewell's brother, was clerk of the courts and kept numerous records which were actually consulted by Cotton Mather when he wrote his history in the fall of 1692. Maybe even some cases a lot more transcripts of the proceedings, and other things as well that probably were destroyed. Samuel Sewell kept a diary. He's the most famous diarist in early New England. He wrote almost every day about every funeral he attended and down to the nth degree. And throughout the summer of 1692, his diary, and he's one of the judges, is almost silent. He says almost nothing about the trials, which makes me wonder, did he censor himself? Did he censor himself in hindsight? Were there pages missing? And one of these days on my to-do list is go look at the original of the diary and see how it's bound, etc. So yeah, I think we definitely lost stuff. But there's a lot of stuff that was never written down or was not intended to survive anyhow, unfortunately. So yeah, good question though.
Looking at the role the clergy played when they were trying to determine how cautious do we need to be with spectral evidence, Mather published the book invalidating such evidence. How did these interventions from the prominent religious leaders erode the trial's legitimacy?
Again, it was a long process, and there's a lot of evidence. We could, as you folks know, we could spend a couple hours just talking about the ministers and their response, good and bad, to the witch trials. We could do a Cotton Mather hour, but I won't put you through that. So I think early on, it's a mixed bag, and I mean, I think the thing we immediately think of as the sort of the first work of the ministers is the return of the ministers on June 15th, and apparently Governor Phipps has asked the leading ministers of the colony, probably at the request of the governor and council, which would have included in the June 13th meeting 4 of the 9 witchcraft judges. There's a request been made from the government about the use of spectral evidence. Interesting in its own right, because again, clearly some people are uncomfortable after Bridget Bishop's execution when they're saying, is our evidence okay? Are we doing this right? What's going on? Um, I'm just seeing Margaret Burns putting in there the Cotton Mather Hour. Yes, oh no, not today. But anyhow, the interesting thing to me about that is that the return itself is one of these things where it says be careful about your use of spectral evidence. Be careful in your use of some of these other things like the touch test. They don't use the touch test by name, but it's clear they're talking about some of these more folklore tests. But in the end, these ministers are deferential to Chief Justice Stoughton and to the court and the judges, and they end up saying and they know that Stoughton is 100% behind spectral evidence, right? Which is again this very dicey stuff because only the victim can see the afflicted, and even in that case, is it really the person, the witch who's afflicting them, whose specter they see? Because Satan is the great deceiver, right? It could be someone else's specter, and the witch and Satan are just using that to get a good person in trouble. So it's a mixed bag. But ultimately, the problem is they end this sort of very balanced, be careful with the evidence, watch out for spectral evidence. But then the last paragraph of this letter is, but keep up the good work, Your Honors. You're doing a great job, and you have our faith in you doing the right thing. And no, it completely undermines everything they said. And if the judges read this, a lot of them go like, okay, we're doing great, no problem, right? So again, even in that is sort of like a mixed bag. But the other thing too I want to mention is there are lesser events even in June that people don't think about that are more kind of direct actions by people. Samuel Willard, who's probably John Willard's uncle, who's already been arrested for witchcraft, and is also, of course, was the minister who observed the possession of Elizabeth Knapp in Groton in 1671. In his sermons on June 12th and June 19th, just after Bridget Bishop's execution, he comes out very much against. He's actually preaches sermons on from First Book of Peter, and he basically gives 2 sermons about how Satan can be the great deceiver, the great trickster, right? And it's quite clear, even though he doesn't talk about the Salem witch trials, that this is exactly what he's talking about, that Satan can impersonate good people. And what happens for his pains? Well, within a few days of that, one of the afflicted girls in Salem says that the specter that's attacking them is the Reverend, and the judges say, no, look again, you're seeing the wrong person. We can tell you it's not Reverend Willard. But again, it probably gave Willard pause to say anything out openly as he had, and he'll end up writing a book anonymously a few months later. And then finally, the other one I earlier wanted to mention, I think, that sort of shows you the opposition that people, even the ministers, faced to raising concerns and having to sort of be very polite in how they do it. William Milbourne, fascinating guy, and he's not a guy who's very diplomatic and polite. He's the Baptist minister. His brother Jacob had been executed in New York for high treason as a part of Leisler's rebellion. And he is kind of a bull in a china shop. He'd actually led a mob before Governor Phipps with Phipps in the North End in 1690. And he starts a petition that same month of June, basically addressing the problems of spectral evidence and other problems with the trials. And he talks about how people, and it's the same point actually that all the ministers are making, is that it's one thing if it's the usual, round up the usual suspects, but we have people of spotless reputations, of good fame, good God-fearing church members that are being accused here. That's different. And Milbourne starts this petition, and the governor and council hear about it, and the next thing you know, he's brought before them and admonished and basically accusing him of seditious libel and saying, you can go to jail or you can pay a $200 bond and post that for good behavior and essentially keep your mouth shut and don't raise any more complaints about this. That was the level of discourse in June, where even if a minister wanted to say the right things, people weren't really ready to listen. Does that make sense? And I will say too, I think the ministers, if we may want to get to it later, I think the ministers play a much more important role in ending the crisis in September and October, when they do maybe what ministers and us academics do best, which is to start writing books and threatening to publish them.
Another way that ministers resisted, you mentioned Elizabeth Knapp in Groton, 1671. Samuel Willard, she, while being apparently possessed, she named somebody as tormenting her, bewitching her, and he refused to give out the name. And
Yeah.
then Cotton Mather even does something like that when the Goody Glover trial is going on. Other people are named, but he doesn't share the names.
Yeah, you see that it's funny because you have the and a similar kind of thing is not made by a minister, but in Portsmouth in the 1650s, when a woman is accused of witchcraft, and they someone one of the witches apparently spouts off like, well, yeah, there's like three others, and they name or five others, and they name a couple of them, one of whom is dead, and they say, and then there's three others who shall be nameless because they're blameless. So yeah, we know if there's witches here, but we're not telling you. I think there was that kind of like, and yes, Cotton Mather, in that point, in 1688, he stops the Goodwin children's accusations turning into something that could be like Salem. And then again, too, Josh, remember, in late 1692, early 1693, when he's counseling Mary Watkins and Mercy Short. Again, there's an effort to someone's suggestion about naming names, and he's going like, no, we're not going there, right? By this time, they'd stopped all the trials in Salem, and again, I am not a fan of Cotton Mather, and I think he is one of the people of the blame pie that gets a healthy dose. But he did try to, he really did, in some ways, did try to sort of calm things down. When it I guess when it suited him maybe or under the right circumstances. I'll also say too, I think in some ways he's the one that, even though he's the ultimate spin doctor and apologist for the government, ultimately with his publication, he also is the one who takes a bullet really to save the colony in his form of government. So again, he's not as evil a figure as perhaps as some popular fiction and even TV shows might suggest.
Yeah, I've seen some of those shows. But as you've mentioned, by the fall of 1692, the opposition was mounting and beginning to undermine the witch trials. The rejection of spectral evidence, especially that fall and into the 1693 with the new court procedures, transformed conviction rates from, they were 100% in the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Everybody who came up before them got convicted. To it's next to zero. There's 3 people out of 50 something, convicted the following year.
And that's because they confess, because they haven't learned the rules of the game and don't realize that they don't have to confess, and that their lives will be spared. And then of course they're pardoned by Phipps. Yeah. I'm sorry. So go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
When the Superior Court of Judicature ruled out spectral evidence, the conviction rates dropped.
Yep.
How significant was this change in legal procedure? And what does the dramatic shift tell us about how truth can be constructed and reconstructed during moral panics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think really spectral evidence was the linchpin of the Salem witch trials, right? It is not normally used. It is, again, all the English experts, pretty anybody said, treat it with care. You can't use that to convict. But in Salem, where they use it and they allow that every single person accused in Salem, the first accusation against them is spectral affliction. And that opens the door for more types of evidence and more accusation. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. Everybody, including although the overwhelming majority of those people who are convicted in the trial court of Oyer and Terminer have pled not guilty. At the end, the last few have actually confessed. But it's like a light switch. Once you change the rules and say, nope, we're not using spectral evidence. The only thing you can use is confession or 2 witnesses who've seen someone commit an act of black magic. When you limit the evidence to that as your sort of primary evidence for convicting someone, everything stops. So And again, you see this earlier, and the Goodwin children, similar case, right, in 1688 is largely based on spectral affliction. Elizabeth Knapp is another sort of case there where that sort of, so the question is a spectral affliction or is it demonic possession? It's a really interesting case. My point is, when spectral evidence is not allowed in any of these cases in New England in the 17th century, you just almost never see convictions. So yeah, clearly those legal standards are really important, and was the one simple thing I think that Governor Phipps and everyone realized would save lives and could bring the whole mechanism crashing down. And in fact, actually, you know, you have people like Thomas Brattle who's sort of saying like, well, this is kind of silly to believe this stuff anyhow, because if you have people confessing that they're witches, why would you want to accept their testimony if they're known witches?
Okay, so the public criticism and the political pressure, we talked about it a little bit.
Yep.
And I'm also wanting, I'm going to ask the question, but there's also just the Puritanism mindset. I want to try to layer this in with this question, but pamphlets like Thomas Brattle's critique and
Yep.
critics like Joseph Putnam, they're challenging the proceedings. What
Yep.
role did public intellectual resistance play in shifting the opinion, and how much pressure did authorities feel?
Yeah, Brattle's a fascinating guy. He's not a member of the Royal Society, as is often said, but still, he was your Harvard intellectual of the late 17th century, beginning to sort of experiment maybe with some rational thinking and scientific sort of ideas. And his letter, this handwritten letter that was circulated in handwritten form, never published, is a masterstroke of an attack on all of the wrong procedures, wrong use of evidence, just that really sort of takes the court of order interpreter apart in the evidence piece by piece. And so it's a masterstroke. I think the real question in my mind, again, is come back to is like, okay, how powerful was it? How important was it? And I think it's certainly because, again, if it's not being published, but Brattle is a very influential guy in Boston. He's got lots of friends. And to what degree is word spreading? And in fact, even in his letter, he talks about some of the people who are upset with what's going on. And again, to me, if you think about this, we do have this one letter that survives, but think of how many other people might have been writing similar letters or having conversations with Brattle and other like-minded people and sort of using the ideas of Brattle and maybe some of the others to spread the word. So I think it was very, very important. But I would want to point out too that it's not just Brattle, right? There are others who are making similar ploys, and I think some of them may have had more power than Brattle. And I think particularly the one document that people often overlook here is the August 8th letter that Major Robert Pike writes from Salisbury to Judge Corwin. In fact, the letter is addressed to, I think it's, what is it, Judge, if I get this exactly right, I think it's to Judge Corwin and those persons at his house in Salem. And it's sent on August 8th. And at the time, Judge Corwin is not just a judge in the witch trials, but also he probably has house guests. He may have other judges who are dining or staying at his home even. So is this again, kind of an open letter to all of the judges? And it's written by Pike, who is one of their colleagues as the member of the Governor's Council, major political military figure in Salisbury, and someone who's really helped organize the petition against Mary Bradbury, against the conviction of Mary Bradbury of Salisbury. And again, he really is the one that sort of talks about this. It uses the same kind of logic in some ways, not as sophisticated as Brattle, not as extensive, but basically says the spectral evidence, this stuff is just not any good. I can't believe you're using it, or that you're using the testimony of people who've confessed to being witches, right? And I mentioned the power of someone like Pike because he is a member of the Governor's Council. And this is inside politics, speaking to people, the governor and his council at the highest levels. And by writing to a fellow member of the council who's a witch trials judge on these things, I think, again, that's just the one letter that survives. But frankly, the simple fact that it survived in Judge Corwin's papers, that Judge Corwin didn't ball it up and throw it away, probably tells you that it had some impact. And so by August, when you have actions by Brattle and him and all these and then the ministers chipping in too, who really are the leading intellectuals of the colony for the most part. Brattle is one of the kind of exceptions, right? Because even at this point, a lot of a lot of the instructors at Harvard and the local intellectuals are the ministers. It's clear that they're starting to rise up and to write letters and probably to speak people. And there's rumors out of books coming out from not just Cotton Mather, but Increase Mather and Samuel Willard. And at that point, I think, people are beginning to see the handwriting on the wall.
So understanding resistance to witch trials offers crucial insights about human agency during moral panics and the importance of individuals who refuse to remain silent. Despite the dramatic end to the trials, very few officials offered meaningful apologies. Perhaps only Samuel Sewall made an unqualified public apology, if you can say it's unqualified. Why were there so few acknowledgments of error? And what does this tell us about how communities processed this mass injustice?
My heart's full with just the mention of Samuel Sewall. Because here's a story where you're looking desperately for heroes, and he's there, big and strong, well, you're right. I mean, he gives as close as you can get, I think, to an unqualified apology. I was in one of his favorite lines. It says, he is upon many accounts more concerned than any that he knows of. I think that's true. Desires to take the blame of it, the blame and shame of it, right? And no waffle here. He's asking pardon of men, especially desiring prayers that God, who has unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all others of his sins, personal and so on. And he's not waffling. There are only a couple other kind of excuse me apologies, right? Ann Putnam, who I think does the best she can with the life that's dealt her, and I think she actually is a victim of the witch trials in many ways as much as anybody else. But even her apology is sort of couched in deluded by Satan, or the legislative petition for a day of fasting for the ills of the colony, which included buried in the middle witchcraft. Even that is clouded in deluded by Satan. And even Reverend Hale, who writes his book really as a critique of the witch trials, in the end says, well, ultimately we were lost in the clouds and deluded by Satan, right? So yeah, I think it seems there are very few who really do that. And again, the 12 jurors, there were 12 of maybe the 50 or 60 jurors. We're not sure exactly how many jurors there were, because there were numerous different sets of juries. You had to have at least one set of 12 for jury trials, and then more for grand juries, and that they met 4 times during the summer. So lots of jurors, and 12 of them actually signed an apology as well. It's undated, but it's published in Caliph. So we know it might have been 1697 as well, at a guess, right? When Sewell's apology is made. But again, it's more of the sort of like waffling. I think there's a lot of things going on with these, right? I think if you think about it, why were there so few? Well, I don't mean to be cynical, but how many open apologies have there ever been in the history of American politics from leading politicians? It's not something people like to do or very good at, for good reason, right? And so all the more honor to someone like Sewall, who said, here's the guy, one of the richest, most powerful men in the colony. And he's prostrating himself really before, well, I guess literally he was probably bowing, but not. And then also apparently, according to family tradition, wore a hair shirt for the rest of his life, which is something Catholic, not Puritan. And then worked hard to get people pardoned, to get restorative justice for the rest of his life. And clearly, before he died, he passed that mission on to his son, who was the minister of South Church, and the other son, who was in the general court, to carry on those efforts, right? But I think, so I think to some degrees here's the other problem too. Again, I hate to come back to this. We just don't know how many personal apologies were issued, right? But I mean, if you compare to America today, how many times will someone come up and say quietly, "I'm so sorry," but they're not going to send a letter to the newspaper probably, or issue a proclamation. And that's the nature of human nature to some degree. So I don't want to go too hard on the people of 1692 because a lot of them seem to have come to peace with this. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that in my book on the aftermath, I'm working on the fact that you had Samuel Nurse and the whole Nurse clan who were willing to forgive Ann Putnam enough that they allowed her to join the Salem Village Church, where for some time the family sat in the same pew together. Talks about people being willing to at some levels either with an open declaration or just with their actions to ask for forgiveness and for it to be granted, right? And to realize the power of forgiveness. So I think that's part of it. But I also, the other thing I think we really have to mention here is that as I like to say, Gallows Hill has cast a long dark shadow over Salem and frankly over America from 1692 to present. And anybody who's ever been in or near Salem for any length of time understands the lasting impact that has. The fact of the amount of shame, right, of public and personal shame that people felt, and not just those people who might have accused or had families who accused, but again, those who maybe didn't stand up or didn't stand up soon enough, right? And I think under the circumstances, it's something that the community to this day still has a very difficult time coming to grasp with. And so I'd like to think, I guess I'd like to think that there were a lot more apologies that were just given in quiet conversation amongst friends and neighbors or one-time enemies. But unfortunately, I will never really know. So I guess that's just going to be my positive thought for the evening, I guess, right? That there was healing because we do know, because a lot about what I'm writing about in the new book is about healing and the fact that there was ongoing efforts to heal in lots of different ways.
I was thinking how Governor Phipps, of course, authorized Cotton Mather's Invisible Wonders. But then Caleb, who has given us details we don't have, he was kind of one of the, I don't want to say last, but a bookend in resistance by countering the book that Cotton had put out. Yeah.
Yes. And Caliph's is the one that was picked up by historians and is kind of the version we have today, not Mather's, right? Yeah. And Phipps, of course, ultimately to me, we can talk about what resistance people took and when it happened. But I think that ultimately, what the lesson here of the Salem witch trials is that you can write letters, you can make petitions, you can organize, but until it reaches to the highest level, things are not going to change. Realize that Governor Phipps might have had some of his doubts about some of these things, again, asking for the ministers, what do you think? But the terrible fact is that he only ultimately ends the witch trials, that he still seems to believe in witch hunts until what happens? Until his wife is cried out upon, until someone suggests that she is a witch, at which point, ball game over, right? And he immediately, pretty quickly writes to the king and the queen saying like, well, we've had some people accused of witchcraft, but I've ended it. Don't worry, no innocent lives were lost. And I've got this great book by Cotton Mather that I'm sending you that proves just that. Of course, Cotton Mather's cherry picking the evidence, as we all know. But no innocent lives were lost. But yeah, they were beginning to accuse people that I know to be innocent. It's like, oh, you mean like your wife and the wife of Increase Mather, the leading minister of the colony, the mother of Cotton Mather, the daughter of John Cotton, Maria Cotton Mather, arguably the most devout person in the colony. If people like her and Lady Mary Phipps are being accused of witchcraft, yeah, but unfortunately in this case, he apparently seemed to at least let things continue up until that point, right? So you need to have your executive authority, would be it the king or the governor, whoever, who's the one that ultimately is responsible for stopping these things. And until they do that, witch hunts will always continue, I'm afraid. That's a horribly depressing thought, isn't it? I guess in some ways, but I guess the good news is they come to an end. and that people do resist, and they do it in a number of ways, and then they also work to heal for them. Someone's asking who Caliph was. Robert Caliph was a Boston merchant. He was an Anglican, not a fan of the Puritans, who wrote a history of the trials published, was it 1700 or 1702? I can't remember, around there. I think it was 1702 when it finally came out. He's most critical of the Puritans, most critical of the Mathers, and but at the same time too, he is the only source we have for some information. So you're never quite sure if he's believable or not, or if he's just saying something, because it's clear in several cases he can be caught in a lie there, that he's saying some pretty nasty things about Cotton Mather, a couple of which we're pretty sure are not true, right? So it's one of these great debates we have as to how much of Caliph's history do we trust. He talks about, for example, Cotton Mather on the executions on August 18th. We talk about Cotton Mather calming the crowd after George Burroughs had made a perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer, and they go ahead and hang him anyhow. And then the crowd rises up and says, wow, maybe he's innocent. He recited the Lord's Prayer. Witches can't do that. Caliph talks about Cotton Mather attending, and Mather on horseback at the execution, which to me is a kind of a stretch to begin with. If you know someone riding a horse up Proctor's Ledge, maybe. Saying from horseback, remember, folks, sometimes the angel of darkness, that is Satan, appears as the angel of light, God. Burroughs is the great deceiver, you see. So that's Caliph, who's one of these, and he ends up getting involved in this tract war with the Mathers that goes on for years, arguing back and forth over the validity of their accounts, and it gets to be very personal attacks. And bottom line is, Increase and Cotton Mather decide to attack Caliph by publicly burning a number of copies of his book at Harvard Common. If you want to ensure the everlasting popularity of a book, just do that. Just publicly burn a large bunch of copies, and it'll become an immediate bestseller. I'm sorry. Okay, I wandered off on that one. I shouldn't have answered that. Where are we, Sarah, Josh? Bring us back home. We probably should get to some questions, right?
Yeah, I just want to say, isn't saying the Lord's Prayer at the execution, isn't that an act of resistance too? Because witches aren't supposed to be able to do that. And
yes,
isn't that kind of punk rock of him to do that at the end there?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's resistance, again, we could talk for hours about the different types of acts of resistance. I think I'm particularly fond of Samuel Wardwell for confessing and then saying, when they actually bring the confession, no, I'm not signing this. I'm changing my plea. It's going to be not guilty, realizing that his life's forfeit, that everybody who's been tried so far has been executed and convicted and executed. Giles Corey saying, you know what? I'll plead not guilty because I'm not guilty. But I realize when I do that, my life's forfeit once again, because guess what? Everyone's going to be executed. So at that point, they say, are you willing to accept a trial by the country? That is a trial by jury. And he just refuses to talk because he knows the game is up. And his act of resistance is to allow himself, literally, this 80-year-old guy, to be pressed to death with rocks put on top of him until he's finally crushed. And there are numerous different ways. Even and some of these are by really important citizens and people who are of a pure reputation. But even someone like Sarah Good, when Nicholas Noyes on the gallows is telling her, "Come now, confess, you'll feel better for it," and she says, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you kill me, God will give you blood to drink," right? She's citing from Revelation, showing Noyes that she knows her Bible and that she's not a witch, and how dare she make such an accusation, right? So I think there are a lot of overt and covert acts of resistance from all of these people, from the perfect recitation to give them blood to drink, right? Yeah, absolutely, Josh. And as they, as it was, the T.S. Eliot, do not go quietly into that good night, I believe, wasn't it? They didn't really, right? But again, they went for the most part really as devout, God-fearing Christians.
That's awesome. Before we move into the questions, do you want to speak at all just to that, the last few centuries on exonerations, but like starting with the families asking for a little restitution and getting names cleared if you want to, I don't know if you want to take a moment, just,
Well, I can take yeah, briefly. I mean, that quite literally is another book,
yeah.
no, it will not be not written for another couple of years. Now I'm starting to talk about it and bounce ideas off of people. But yeah, the efforts of restorative justice really started in 1692 and continue, frankly, to this day, right? And particularly with the petitioning by the families, again, starting really even before the trials were over, to get their loved ones out of prison, or if they've been convicted, to get what they called a restoration of innocency, what we would call a pardon or a reversal of attainder, or simply restorative justice, right? An acknowledgement that they have been wronged and that the families have been harmed morally and as well as financially, and to try to make amends. And to me, again, that is to me is part of really part of really this whole effort of resistance is the fight did not stop even after the last person got out of jail, right? It continued, and really the fire was lit by these people. And in fact, in the aftermath, they unified. They had met each other at the trials. That they'd met each other attending the executions, visiting loved ones in prison. As we know, there actually was a marriage that resulted out of this, and other alliances. And so these families would continue to work together for decades, working together to get petitions when the government refused to provide pardons, refused to provide restitution, and they really became a force that continued signing petitions until I think the last one was about 1748 or 49 by George Burroughs' like grandchildren. Over 50 years after the witch trials, these people are continuing to resist, to seek justice for their loved ones, even if they were personally long gone. And I say too, I think that is one of the reasons, frankly, is because of this resistance that the Salem witch trials are so absolutely well known, is because the victims, the surviving victims, their families, their neighbors, their friends refused to let this die, and they resisted until this day. Look at the acts that we've seen in the past couple of years. In 2022, where we had really the civics project in a middle school class in North Andover, where the teacher and students worked to get Elizabeth Johnson Jr. finally pardoned, or even more recently than that, when we've had a stretch of Interstate 495 in Amesbury, named in honor of Susanna Martin, whose farm was on that property, who of course was executed in 1692 as well. And now to the more recent effort, I don't know if we want to mention that or not, Sarah or Josh, with the most recent effort with the legislature, might be a good way to sort of segue towards questions. Tell folks about the effort we're currently working on.
Right. There are 8 individuals who were convicted of witchcraft before Salem, convicted in Boston. These were Massachusetts witch trials before 1692. There's 8 convicted, 5 of them were hanged. We're looking to get them the same recognition that the Salem witch trial convicted have received. And we also want an acknowledgement just of the injustice, and that everybody deserves some recognition.
Yeah, the group of us working on this, it's the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project. And there's a petition that you can go look at on change.org, change.org/witch trials. And also MassachusettsWitchTrials.org has history of those that we're speaking of, and the rest of the people that show up in the records of having experienced accusations of witchcraft in the Massachusetts colony in the 17th century. All right, so let's, I saw, a couple questions in here just about how did the oh shoot, I'm not gonna be able to spit that word out. The Puritanism, there we go, culture impact whether people spoke up or didn't speak up?
Well, it's a good question. You would think people might be likely to speak up, because for most Puritans to become a member of the church under the traditional rules, which will change in mid-17th century in many parishes, people must have their confession read to before all the fellow church members. In the 17th century, a church is not a building. A church are the body of saints, of Puritan saints who believe that God has spoken to them and that they believe that they're headed to heaven. And if you want to become a Puritan saint, so for example, as Ann Putnam did, she was attending church like everyone, or attending worship like everyone would. But when she wanted to formally join the church, she had to write down sort of a confession of her sins, begging forgiveness for God and everyone that she's harmed, and also to essentially, maybe discussing every sin you've ever committed, and also, in addition to that, how God may have spoken to you and let you know that you're amongst the elect. People who have the courage to do that before a large public gathering, I would think, might have the courage to speak up. But on the other hand, I will say too, we do know by the 1680s and 1690s that there's a real decline in church membership in Massachusetts Bay in Puritan churches. And I think one of those problems was people were having, that's a tough thing to do. And the churches that tended to be growing were those who'd loosened their rules. But I will say this as far as Puritan culture, one thing I do want to make clear. They're really, I actually wrote a paper on this recently for the Oxford Encyclopedia of Puritanism, and on Puritans and witchcraft. And the question was, gee, look at Salem, look at the East Anglian witch hunts, look at Bermuda. Seems like there's a lot of relationship between Puritans and witchcraft, isn't there? Does this say something particular, not just whether people would speak up or not, but just whether they would accuse, frankly? Does that say something about Puritanism? And I think the short answer is no, because if you actually look at the amount of accusations, not just even amongst Puritans, but amongst Calvinists, it's not a real good indicator of where you're going to have witch hunts, because the majority of witch hunts actually take place on the continent of Europe in areas of religious tension, but it's all sorts of Catholic Protestant tension that doesn't have to do with Puritans. The Puritans or even Calvinists are only involved in a small fraction of cases. But again, to me, what it's indicative of is, particularly in New England and America, where the Salem witch trials are this one sort of famous event. People have this. We created the stereotype of witchcraft, frankly, being sort of afflicted girls dressed in black and white, writhing on the floor while stern-faced parents look on. And that's just, that the stereotype isn't true for Puritans who enjoyed a companionable drink in the tavern, who wore bright colors, who enjoyed smiling and having fun, but also too, we're probably not necessarily more prone to witch hunts than other parts of the European world in the 16th or 17th century. So, but to our localized view, it's like it seems to be all about Puritans, doesn't it? Because yes, it's true that there were very, very few, almost no witch hunts in places like Maryland or Virginia, but there were a few. So maybe we've dispatched the Puritan question. So you don't have to say Puritanism again, Sarah. What else you got?
There we go.
Were any of the petitions effective?
Well, I think the combined weight, I think, again, the closest of the ones in the summer of 1692, the closest to being effective, and maybe you could say ultimately were effective, were the nurse petitions, right? Because again, if we don't know how the jury worked, and then as now, that's a sacred proceeding. But there was enough evidence thrown in some of these petitions to really undermine a lot of the credibility of many of the afflicted. And again, to me, the most concerted effort were made by the nurses. And isn't that interesting? That is the one case where you have, again, a woman of spotless reputation, a Puritan saint, beloved grandmother, that everyone admits, and has all the petitions, and is also the one person who has that initial verdict of not guilty. And frankly, again, if lawyers were allowed, that would have been the ball game. the lawyer would have said, thank you to the jury, thank you, Your Honor, we're out of here. Right? So maybe that one was effective. I do think ultimately the combined weight of the petitions for the restoration of innocency and reparations ultimately take effect when what in 1703, where we have the first pardons, and then the more general pardon and restorative justice and reparations in 1710. But so again, I think it's sort of by that point it gets to be an overwhelming weight that something needs to be done. But it's again for us, it's hard to see the cause and effect because we didn't have court reporters or newspapers or people writing editorials back then too, or even letters from these individuals that survive.
There's a question here about Cotton Mather's grave in North End in Boston, and the person visiting it and finding herbs on the stone, and just wondering what that might mean. And I think it's an important question because at these memorials, people who come, they are his isn't a memorial, it's his memorial, but people visit and they do feel compelled to leave these gifts. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't know my herbology. I wish I knew the significance of what that might be, and maybe I'm sure there's someone in the audience who will. So I don't know that, but I do agree with you. Very powerful at the memorials. In both Salem memorials, you'll see offerings being left, and sometimes even notes from descendants. And I can't, let's put it this way, I can't imagine there not being some real significance to whatever that herb was, but I wish I knew more about 17th century herbs. I have a friend who's written a book on sort of the practical Renaissance, Dr. Donna Seeger, and I'll have to ask Donna if she would know what the significance of that might be. Of course, I guess we need to know what the herb is. We don't know what the herb is. We just know it is an herb of some kind. Is that the problem? Okay.
Yeah.
Take a picture next time.
Here's a question. In the lens of political economy, were the social elites of New England asserting their political power in a landscape where you have French Native American conflicts on the periphery? How outspoken were New England societies speaking out against the skirmishes in the hinterland?
Well, that depended on where you were. If if your major church and George Burroughs helping trying to defend Falmouth, present day Portland, from a combined attack by 400 French and Native Americans, you have some pretty loud opposition. Unfortunately, I think the further south you get, and this is coming from someone who's coming to you from my dining room in York, Maine. I think Maine, and to a lesser degree New Hampshire, felt that they were hung out to dry throughout decades of frontier warfare, which frankly usually only affected the frontier settlements that rarely even got into more of the heartland in like Essex County. And when they did, they were very much on the edges of the frontier, at least in later wars, right? King Philip's War maybe a little different kettle of fish. So I think, it's interesting because the opposition, the complaints are all being filed by the leading citizens, the magistrates, the militia officers on the northern frontier. And it seems to be most of the politicians, once you get down to sort of, greater Boston, seem to be content not only to let the frontier be sacrificed, but to some degrees insisting there are laws that the legislature literally passes, making it illegal for people to abandon their homes in the towns, in towns on the frontier, that they must stay and defend them. They will send them some token forces from time to time, right? So I've always been sort of struck by, I think that to me the response from the legislative leaders at this time is maybe not sort of active politicking in that way, but instead realize what they see as in many ways as the root cause of the witch hunt and also warfare on the frontier, and that is God's anger at New England for its apparent, decline in Puritan fervor, right? And so instead, in 1690, what is the Governor's Council doing? They are issuing a proclamation for moral reformation. They're not issuing a proclamation, the interim government, to send more troops to Maine and New Hampshire and to Deerfield. Instead, they're saying, like, we need people to get back into church. We need kids to get back into school and reading the Bible. And we need, less, we need, taverns closing or one and done at most. And we need true moral reformation. And that is the only thing that is going to restore our colony to its true and proper place and bring peace and harmony. So, again, but this is sort of, shall I say, this is maybe the take of someone who lives in Wabnakia on the frontier. I look out my window and I see the site where the York Raid of 1692 started at Snowshoe Rock, where the Native Americans, with many just grievances against people in York and elsewhere, piled up their snowshoes before going on to attack the village the next morning. So again, I'm just maybe giving a little perspective from the frontier inward to the complexities of Puritan politics. And I'd also say maybe from a modern perspective, someone who was born and raised in Fitchburg, sort of outside the hub, one of the sort of central and western Massachusetts people who maybe to this day sort of feel, dare I say, somewhat disenfranchised in Massachusetts politics because we're a long way from Beacon Hill. But I really shouldn't get into modern politics.
Did the accused and their supporters have economic leverage? Thinking of grassroots economic leverage asserted in the last few days to restore Jimmy Kimmel.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if there's any economic leverage used in 1692. It would have been interesting to see. I mean, in some degrees, it was almost the opposite. As I think about it, you would have thought. I'm thinking of Philip English, who was the wealthiest merchant in the colony, who's literally ruined by Sheriff Corwin and the government. He spends the rest of his life unsuccessfully trying to restore his fortune. One would think that someone like that who'd been accused of witchcraft, if people wanted to sort of vote with their feet economically in support of him, might have tried to help him and help his business. But I don't know of any. Again, people might have done something like this, but we don't see any evidence of people using really economic power. I mean, I think to me, when we think of things like boycotts, that's a really good question. And now I'm going to have to start. I probably won't sleep tonight thinking about this because it's very interesting. But as far as I can think of, the first real boycotts we have that are economic, that show sort of economic power, really take place in the 1760s, and really starting like with the actions taken against the Stamp Act, where they're beginning to organize people to boycott the British goods. It'd be nice to think something like that might be going on in 1692, but I can't think of any evidence of it. But would certainly be fun to keep our eyes open for something like that. It might be interesting. We do have merchant account books that survive from that time period from Salem, including some of the leading families like Philip English and others. And there you go. It'd be an interesting master's thesis to look at those account books and look at the politics of those merchants in 1692 and see if they got less trade in that time. It'd be really interesting because people really might have been at least subtly voting with their wallets there. But there you go. There's a good thesis topic for somebody.
And I was just thinking about the firewood withholding that was happening prior to the witch hunts.
Right. I mean, there is, if you look at of course, is in the fall of 1691, the Salem Village elects a new committee, which is the committee that is responsible for going out and collecting the tithe to pay the minister's salary and also to provide his firewood. And of course, that committee, in fall of 1691, 5 members of opponents of Paris, including Thomas Putnam's half-brother Joseph, are elected to that body. And they refuse to collect the taxes, and they refuse to collect the firewood. And there was kind of an economic warfare there. But having said that too, Sarah, remember that the same trick had been tried by opponents of other Salem ministers in that sense too, right? I mean, George Burroughs leaves town the same way. When they stop paying his salary, he says, "Okay, well, it's about time for me to go back to Maine anyhow." So in that sense, yeah, there are some really interesting examples of that, where people were not attending the church. And we do know too, even after that, there were people that refused to pay their church dues. And the unspoken assumption was it was a silent, or at least silent to us, protest against Reverend Paris, right? Yeah. Good point.
I see one more question here. Please feel free to continue adding. We've got about 15 minutes left. But Dr. Baker, why do you think there were very few witch trials in Anglican Virginia, in Roman Catholic Maryland, given that both denominations had a history of witch trials in England and on the continent?
Well, I think you have to look at what factors create witch hunts, right? Some of these we talked about last time, but it is, I mean, I call my book Storm of Witchcraft because it takes a large number of things going wrong at once, religiously, politically, economically, climatologically. Worst weather in a long time produces drought, leads to famine, leads to inflation, warfare, political instability. Wolfgang Behringer saying, bad weather and political instability equal witch hunts. And so if you look at Maryland and Virginia, everything was not entirely hunky-dory in these colonies. As a matter of fact, this week in my class, we're talking about the Tobacco Society in the Chesapeake in the 17th century and little shindig called Bacon's Rebellion, right? Where where you have basically a bunch of rabble who basically started a war first against the Native Americans, against the government itself, and it leads to increased slavery in Virginia. But having said that, you do not, you see in Maryland, which is a place of great toleration, right? It is a colony where people are allowed to worship as they see fit, whether they be Catholic or Puritan or Anglican. You don't have the degree of tension of political, economic, religious tension that you would in New England. Same thing is true for Virginia, which is pretty much overwhelmingly an Anglican colony, and is largely a royal colony. Where again, with that kind of hiccup in 1676 for Bacon's Rebellion, there is not a lot of high levels of distress and anxiety, I would argue. And some of my, I don't pretend to be. I mean, I got my PhD from William and Mary, but I am certainly not a 17th century Chesapeake expert. But I think that if you look at the levels of difficulty, they're different. There is, I will say too, is there is the other problem is in Virginia, much of this is more bare survival, right? We do know one thing is when people are basically eking out a living, there's no accusations for witchcraft. The first formal accusation for witchcraft in New England is what, 1647. If you consider that the first year-round permanent settlement that lasted was Plymouth in 1620, that's 27 years before we see the first formal charge of witchcraft. Why is that? Well, it's because when people are just bare subsistence, trying to get a roof over their heads, trying to chop down trees so they can plant crops, the furthest thing from their mind is accusing people of witchcraft. All right. And I think if you look at Virginia in the 17th century, it is in some ways a much more hardscrabble existence for many people. One of the big points that Virginia historians make is that what an impermanent society it was. New England is largely sort of chain migration of family and neighbors, multi-generations of the same families coming and living sometimes in the same household. And because of the climate and the conditions, people live to pretty ripe old ages. They have a longer life expectancy in a town like Andover or Dedham or Salem than they would in England. Virginia is not like this. Virginia is an economic disaster. In the 17th century Virginia, the average, let's see, a third of a third of all children born lose a parent before they're 20, and half of them are orphans, and a huge percentage of them, maybe like a third of them, don't even reach 20 years old because and indentured servants, about 10% of the indentured servants die every year. Horrible climatic conditions, really hot. Imagine working 60, 70 hours a week in a tobacco field in Virginia. I've spent enough time in Virginia to not even want to do archaeology there. let under modern conditions with air conditioning and such and nearby. And between that and tropical disease, malaria, people are just in many ways struggling to survive and don't really necessarily expect that they or their children might be around in 10 or 20 years. And I think so a lot of the energy went in different directions in those other colonies, right, than in New England. But that's there have been a few things published on witchcraft in the Chesapeake that you might want to take a look at, but it's not a very fruitful field because there just are not many cases, right? Oh, and the other thing too, of course, is a lot of energy increasingly goes into what? Controlling that slave population. And so instead, when you do have some cases, in the late 17th and 18th century in the Chesapeake, and even, of course, in the New York slave revolt, it involves kind of race relations, and the accusations are no longer witchcraft, but they're related to poisoning, which in many societies, particularly even modern societies, there's a relationship between witchcraft. Witches are seen as poisoners as well too. So maybe part of the answer is like you need to cast your net more broadly when you're trying to find what a witch accusation is and how you're making it. But I think, yep, I think you could write a good book on why there weren't so many witch hunts in other parts of America. So there you go. There's another idea for you.
From Sarah Stewart, what comes out of this discussion to her is the rise of fairly widespread resistance to witch trials, and that seems to be the more interesting story rather than that of the victims. What do you think gave them the courage to stand up for what they believed was right, if not Puritanism, then cultural congregationalism? Nothing in particular?
I think there is a strong weight of Puritans to acknowledge sin, to acknowledge evil, to call it out, right? I mean, and I don't want to single Puritans for that. I think most people, be they Christian or otherwise, right, but most people have a strong moral compass and want to do the right thing. But I do think again there is a sort of tradition in Puritanism that in Puritans, frankly, I think amongst Catholics too, that idea of confession, right? That is if you see evil, then you want to do what you can to try to address it. And if you don't, to some degrees, to what degree are you shouldering some of the blame for that, right? And I think to me, New England had this really, Massachusetts had this horrible crossroads it faced in the fall of 1692 that I talk about in Storm of Witchcraft. When Governor Phipps ends the trials, he also starts, he allows Cotton Mather's book to be published because it's a naked apology for the government, but then he issues a publication ban. And he won't allow the truth to come out. And he and Cotton Mather both realize that if the truth really comes out, it's going to be clear that innocent lives were lost. And the new charter of 1691 is going to just disappear, just like the old 1629 charter. And Massachusetts may end up it'll be the end of the Puritan experiment. Massachusetts may end up with Colonel Edmund Andros and the Dominion of New England back, which was in some ways close to a military dictatorship, right? Where Puritanism was no longer unique, and this really offended the Puritans. The thoughts that they had to share their meeting house with Anglicans, they saw it as their meeting house as being defiled. Now, to us, it's a ludicrous notion. But I think they had to, on the one hand, in order to save the colony and its Puritan state as that Puritan experiment, the Puritan city upon a hill, they could not admit the sin of allowing innocent victims to die. And I think for many people, that really created a moral crisis that rose up to a fester and a boil, right? And as Michael Wigglesworth writes about a few years after that, that basically God's complaint with Massachusetts, right? And that nothing had gone right since the witch trials. And he and others know part of the problem is they have never been able to openly acknowledge the sin that Massachusetts committed in letting innocent lives be lost. And they only start to make partial amends for that in 1696 when they agree for that day of humiliation and fasting. And even then, it's limited, right? And in part it's limited, I think, because, well, lots of reasons, but frankly, part of it is legal liability. The colony can't openly say, yep, we did it, because then they open themselves up to lawsuits. but also too, they have to be careful what they say because they need to save Massachusetts as that Puritan city upon the hill, or frankly, after the witch trials, maybe what's left of it. So Puritans are interesting people, and I put a plug in, and their Partnership for Historic Boston has a number of really good talks over the years from people like Frank Bremer and others on Puritans, and I guess well, Lori's talk next month should be interesting as well too. So there's lots of good stuff in the past that you can watch online, and also coming in the future to give you a better idea on Puritans, because they are complicated folk.
Definitely. Well, I think we need to wrap it up there. We've only got a couple minutes left. So I want to say thank you to you, Emerson, and Sarah, of course. And thank you to Partnership of Historic Bostons and everyone that's tuned in.
Yes, thank you so much. And if you didn't catch part 1, go back and catch that. That has a lot of this, more layers of this available.
And everyone, I want to extend a thank you for your attention, your engagement, your great questions. I really enjoyed the conversation, the questions that those prompted. Thank you also to Dr. Baker and Sarah Jack and Josh Hutchinson for sharing your expertise and perspective. There was so much rich content from Dr. Baker's books that made its way. And of course, Sarah and Josh's expertise really brought it to life. So really, really fascinating, rich discussion. If you do want to know more about the Salem witch trials, or any other issues that the partnership explores, please do visit historicbostons.org. You want to look for the Read tab. We have a number of resources available for you, and we also are getting more book reviews up and accessible so that you can get a deeper sense of some of the books that are available. We will go ahead and send a copy of the recording tomorrow. We will also send a survey if you would kindly fill that out. We share this information with donors, just part of our accountability process. We also review data not only to document our successes, but gain insight on how we can help and evolve. Indeed, the book club, one of the reasons that came about, it was a comment on a survey. We do have a couple events that are coming up. You have what's featured on the screen, Gathered into a Church, and this is going to be a wonderful talk, a wonderful presentation, because what it's going to do is it's going to show, Lori Rogers Stokes is going to show us how diverse the church was at this point. So she kind of busts through assumptions that we may have. And so she brings diversity to the fore. She's also a really dynamic presenter. So I do hope you'll check in on that. Be wonderful. And also, I want to just give you a heads up. Look at the website, historicbostons.org. Jean Pickering, she's going to be talking about slavery and witchcraft. Again, it's another aspect of this whole conversation. And I've been able to talk with Jean. She's wonderful, has wonderful insight. So I think that's going to be a fantastic conversation. So I think with that, and again, the date for Lori Rogers Stokes is on October 6th, and Jean Pickering's talk is going to be on October 28th. Friendly reminder, truly, this discussion really set the stage. You could dive into this now and just be really a nice complement to this discussion. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for your time, for your attendance. We really appreciate you. You make it possible. And we hope that you have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you at another event soon.